I'm Melissa Beck, the Executive Director of the Sozosei Foundation. We're in day 2 of the summit, and I am so excited to introduce this amazing group of people who are here. I have to read that we made this title a little too long. Okay. The title of this amazing panel is One Call, 3 Questions, Transforming the Culture of Emergency Response. Once again, we have Yolanda in her excellent moderation role, along with esteemed colleagues. You'll see about them on Whova in your programs, and I'm just going to let you take it away, Yolanda.
Thank you. All right. Hi, friends. We're back together again, and it's so nice to see you. We're going to try to have this conversation after lunch, and so I want to just kind of give you a little bit of a warning. Some of this stuff is really heavy. You will hear and see content from actual events that transpired to support this work and this conversation today. So I just wanted to kind of give you a heads up as you're coming in. Take care of yourself if you need to, because it can get quite heavy. So I have a wonderful panel of panelists today, and I'm very excited about them being here. Some of them flew in just for this conversation, and I do want to show appreciation for them doing that. So immediately to my left is Dr. Jen Skeem. Immediately to her left is Dr. Maya Cullins, who is here in honor of her son, Nigel Cullins. And to her left is Chief Derick Miller from Irving, Texas. Is the chief of police of that police department. You can check out their bios. They're wonderful people doing great things across the country. But in the interest of time, I want to just kind of jump right into our conversation today. So I think many of you are clear that there have been recent calls to reimagine 911, and 988 is now kind of part of that conversation. I think we're all excited about the promise that 988 has, but part of what we wanted to do today is also kind of level set that some people will still call 911. And there are still opportunities to be able to kind of really wrap around that system and provide additional support that helps families like Dr. Cullins have better outcomes when they call for help. So part of today's discussion is really thinking about our nation's emergency call centers as a good opportunity at the first point of call to apply some of these new innovations and approaches that we'll be working through today. Let me also say that all the people here have been following 988 and all the evolution of that system. And we think it holds great promise, but one of the things that we will talk about a little bit today is what happens when you call 988 and there's a need to kind of transfer it back to 911. What will that look like, particularly if there needs to be some type of resource deployed at the time of the call? So I'm going to go through kind of a short little PowerPoint to kind of tell you a little bit about some of the work we're doing. As you know, I mentioned earlier today that I work for the Meadows Institute, and part of what we are doing at Meadows is kind of upstarting our work around our Center for Justice and Health. And part of that is really thinking about the justice and safety and well-being of people. And we don't necessarily cast it as we are working with law enforcement, we're working with families, we're working with people who are living the experience. And living the experience means that at any point in time that a person is having a crisis, that ecosystem of people who need to respond to them are the people who we're trying to make sure have better outcomes, better resources, and ultimately put us in a position where we have a better system that responds to folks. So today's conversation will be level set with 2 different principles. The first is really that all of this work that we're talking about in this project specifically is about having a more person-centered approach. That's a medical term. It's not necessarily something that we use a lot in the justice space. But what it means is that people are human beings, they have value, and we should allow them to participate in outcomes in the assessment of their care. And we extend that person-centered approach not just to the person in crisis, but also to families who have been working with their family members and trying to figure out methods of care for very long periods of time. And so we heard earlier today about, like, you should include people with lived experience. That's a center point for this conversation today. And then the second piece is about procedural justice. You heard the judges talk a lot about this, but what that means for us very simply is that if you are on the north side of town, the south side of town, the west side of town, the east side of town, whatever the service capacity is, it should be the same, and you should be treated fairly and the same from whatever jurisdiction or place you're from. And so this idea that the process should be fair for everyone is really where procedural justice kicks in. And not only that, I think, one of the things we talk about very often, and we'll talk about a little bit today, is it's also where racial equity comes into, because it centers itself on the fact that you're going to treat all people equally and all people fairly. So that picks up in that as well. So before we tell you a little bit about what the person-centered approach is, I think it's very important for us to center the conversation with an example, a real life example. And so what you are about to hear and see is the experience of Dr. Maya Cullins and her family when she lost her son, Nigel Cullins, who was 22 years of age, a bright star of their family and in the community. And he had a mental health crisis, and she needed some help. And she, as her last resort, needed to call 911 in order to get him a transport to the hospital, a hospital that she had already called to ensure that a bed was available for him. And somehow that was not able to be accomplished. And so before we talk about what PCTA is, and I turn to the panel to have discussions about their role in this, I think it's important for you to see this very important video. So we're going to show you that now.
Families, church, I have everybody. So when it came to my own, I knew to call to make sure inpatient treatment was available.
A career built on helping others meant that Maya Speller was always ready to help her own son as he battled mental health issues through the years. But now she is watching her worst nightmare come to life. Her son's name, Nigel Cullins, 22 years of age, shot and killed by Atlanta police inside Fogo de Chao restaurant in Buckhead off of Piedmont Road. Officers say before the shooting, he shot a security guard who tackled him. Cullins' family says he was suffering a mental health crisis, and they had just called 911 a few hours earlier, trying to get him some help. And as Don White reports, they feel his life could have been spared if that help had arrived sooner.
I need the EMS to come and get him. I don't need police. And I want to make sure if they do come, that they're trained. I'm a doctor. My son is inside. He is in a manic phase. He doesn't have any weapons. He's not a threat, but he is hallucinating.
Maya Speller told us this afternoon she made that 911 call from her son, Nigel Cullins' Midtown apartment around 5 yesterday evening. She says the 22-year-old was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she was calling 911 to have EMTs take him to a facility.
The pain that I feel is a pain that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. And I don't even have no enemies, but I would wish it on them. It's a pain that I can't even explain.
But she says help didn't arrive for about 3 hours, and by then her son had already gone to Fogo de Chao, where he ended up dying.
He had a good heart. He had good friends. He gave his shirt off his back. He didn't deserve it.
A worker in the restaurant called 911 saying Cullins had a gun and was acting erratically, making people nervous.
He pushed the bartender out of the way, and like I said, he's got a gun on his belt.
But did he point the gun at you? That's what I'm saying. Did he threaten you with the gun?
He did not point the gun, but he's yelling at everybody.
Atlanta police say when they responded, they found Nigel Cullins in the bar, but he resisted. An officer tried to tase him, but it didn't work. Then police say Cullins pulled out a gun and started firing it inside the restaurant. A restaurant security guard was shot, and officers fired back at Cullins, killing him. It's unclear if police realized Cullins was suffering a mental health crisis and made the connection to the 911 call his family had made hours earlier in Midtown.
We took the family's concerns directly to Atlanta police. They would not comment because of the ongoing investigation into what happened, but they shared APD's policy outlining how to deal with people having a mental health crisis, including in part approaching the victim in a calm manner, contacting a mental health center if the victim is agitated, and treating adults as adults, not children. Here's law enforcement analyst Dr. Cedric Alexander, his perspective. He told us he believes the officers were within their right to use deadly force because of the public safety risk.
This person, the subject, the deceased, pulled a weapon, shot a security guard, and therefore the police officers acting within the purview of their responsibility saw others.
So let me, first of all, when we do this panel, we do have a lot of information that we want to share, but I always want to take a moment to acknowledge and hold space, and I'm getting a little emotional too, and hold space for the fact that we have a young man who's not here with us and his mother is. And so I just want to hold a second, just space for a second to give her the honor that she deserves with her son. So, you know, we've done this a couple of times, and that video always kind of gets me. It's hard to watch. It's hard to understand how these things happen. But I will say they are deeply complicated issues. If you think about what was in the call, there was a call for help. If you listen, the response didn't come for 2 hours. If you listen, you will hear that there was a conversation about officers being well within their rights to act in the way that they did. There is this idea that if they had come earlier, would Nigel even have been in the restaurant where he was shot? And so we know that these are deeply complicated issues and concerns for call centers and for infrastructures that are responsible for response. Part of what we are trying to do here is really understand that call center professionals don't have as many tools as we think they have in order to really kind of assess risk, particularly suicide and violence. And in addition to that, they rely a lot upon the tools that they have, and one of the tools they have is personal judgment about what the right resource is in order to send. And so part of this conversation today is about structured judgment. It's about giving tools to better triage those calls that come in, and ultimately work with folks like Chief Miller and his department and his colleagues, along with mobile crisis support services, to understand not only what resource to send, but how quickly to send it, and ensure that they are held in priority along with all of the other calls that have to be attended to. So I want to take a moment to turn to Jen Skeem, who is really been my co-lead in this conversation around PCTA, which is, we call it PCTA, but it's person-centered triage approach. That's where we've landed. And Dr. Skeem, there are so many calls that come into call center. I think it's 240 million over the course of a year are directed to 911. Talk to us about this idea of understanding risk, understanding opportunities to put in place better judgment tools for call centers.
I'm happy to. So the focus here is on call centers. And, you know, in call centers, there's professional judgment that is exercised, but professional judgment is exercised in all kinds of other spaces as well. And it's really just a fancy phrase for an expert guess. It's our best guess. And in this case, the professional judgment is about a person's dangerousness. So it's really trying to make an expert guess about how likely this person is in a given situation to hurt others or hurt themselves. Professional judgment or guesses are the standard of practice, not just in call centers. They are the standard of practice in all kinds of criminal justice and psychiatric settings. So we see this exercised all the time by judges and parole officers and probation officers in the criminal justice system, whether it's about pretrial detention or post-conviction release. We see it exercised all the time by clinicians in emergency rooms and other places. And what they are doing in these settings are making legal decisions that turn very strongly on that decision or judgment about a person's dangerousness. And without empirical guidance, without structured decision tools, they are left with their own intuitive impressions, their own seat-of-the-pants judgments. That is the standard of practice today, and it's important to recognize that that is true across a number of contexts. It's also important to recognize that this is a problem. This is a problem because we have decades of research that indicates that we're not very good at forecasting the future, even when we have a lot of clinical or legal or other kinds of training, and even when we have a lot of information, which is often not the case, by the way, in these settings. So what we see is that unstructured judgment, these sort of intuitive judgments that are made all the time about dangerousness, are usually no more accurate than a coin toss. So it's really just barely above that in most situations. And it's not helped, again, it's important to underscore, it is not helped by experience. It's not helped by training, even though people will say, well, I know better than that. So I'm a clinical psychologist with expertise in this area, and I would be the first to say that just like an expert call taker, I would get it wrong a lot of the time. It's important to start there. Mostly as humans, it's important to understand that what we're going to do is overestimate the risk of dangerousness in these types of situations. That's typically what we do. And we're especially likely to do that in these situations because the person we're considering is someone who has a mental illness oftentimes, and we know from lots of research on stigma that that's linked with perceptions of dangerousness. And it is also going to be an overestimate if we know that the person we're considering is Black, because we have a lot of biases, implicit and otherwise, that link color with perceptions of risk. So we're inaccurate a lot. We tend to overestimate risk. The opposite happened in the case of Nigel, and I think that is probably because his mother understood some of those tendencies, which is something that we could come back to in a bit. What I want to do is say that the person-centered approach that we're interested in exploring with call centers involves two ways of doing things better. The first way is a traditional approach. It's something we've known for a long time that we just need to implement. So the traditional way is structuring or replacing that intuitive judgment with a risk assessment tool or something else that we know from decades of research will help us be a lot more accurate than we can be, especially in really tight situations with just using our judgment. Even a screener, a couple of well-placed questions, a couple of data points could go a long, long way in making our decisions more consistent and helping us get right whether we're dealing with a situation that's low risk or high risk. And that is first base for making sure that the response is correct. I'll talk more later about the piece that we're more excited about, which is a more innovative approach and a better, it's an innovative way to do better, and it's where the person centering really comes into play. It's about partnering with the person in crisis who is living the experience to improve the outcomes of the situation. It's about listening to the expertise of people who are living through this crisis. They're often people who have lived these experiences before, so they know better than call takers and better than anyone else for that matter the conditions under which their loved one is likely to be at risk and what to do about it.
And so part of what we want to do to add just complete context to what Dr. Skeem is saying is that there are three components that we're really talking about that are evidence informed, and she will talk a lot about the data around the evidence informed questions, which I think are it's phenomenal. But there are three components. The first is really kind of understanding risk, and we have it here, but I'll just kind of, for the purpose of this conversation, is early identification of, at the point of call, that it is a mental health call. So an example of this is in Austin, Texas, where when you call Austin, they no longer ask you, 911, what is your emergency? What they say is, do you need mental health, police, fire, or mental health? And what that does is automatically diverts that call out. They do have the benefit of having a clinician on the floor, so it diverts them to a clinician that can immediately respond to the caller. But what it also does, which we don't have a lot of data around, is it actually helps to start categorizing which calls are coming in and they are mental health. Now, it's not a foolproof, right? It doesn't catch everything, but it certainly does identify those calls that are up front. We know that there's a mental health issue. The second part is about recognizing exactly what Dr. Skeem said, which is that that folks can tell you, if asked the right questions with fidelity, they can tell you that they're experiencing crisis, and they also can tell you, give you information about their perceived propensity for self-harm or violence. The third part of that is then asking them, what is your preferred outcome? Sound crazy, doesn't it? Sounds really crazy. I'll just let that sink in for you. Like, you're calling 911 and they're asking you what your preferred outcome is. Never heard it before. And that's the innovative piece of this that we'll talk a little bit about, because as Dr. Cullins said, which we'll go straight into her comments here, is I'm trying to transport my son. Attunement. They are actually, in some instances, very clear about what they're trying to accomplish. The third part is about resilience, which Chief Miller will talk about, which is, listen, 2 hours was too long. And there are a lot of things happening. Blood and bullets, people are shooting. There are people who have all kinds of issues that they're trying to tend to in the community. And we need to kind of figure out what the actual response should be. What we know is that very often mental health and suicide calls are deprioritized, and they're prioritized really, really low. So I just wanted to kind of add context to the comments that Dr. Skeem just mentioned. So Dr. Cullins, I want to talk to you a little bit about what you were trying to accomplish in the call. You are a doctor. You've done this, you help people all the time, but you thought it was very important for you to say that Nigel was not violent, that Nigel was not at risk at that moment to harm himself. Why did you feel it was so important to kind of share all of that information when you were trying to get help?
One is because my son is African American. Two, he stayed in Midtown, which is downtown Atlanta. And actually, it's a lot of police and everything that was actually around in that area. However, nevertheless, I didn't want my son to end up in a body bag. So I did what I had to do to intervene and de-escalate the situation while I was there and present with him for 2 hours straight to prevent anything from happening. And I also wanted to be clear with the police, like, make sure that they're trained. And even if they wasn't trained and they came, I didn't want them to come with such force that he'll end up in a body bag. And prior to me calling 911, which it was my last resort, was to make sure I did all the formalities that they teach you, that you know, call, make sure you have a bed. Now, I can only imagine mothers that don't have the knowledge or resources to know who to call, when to call, and what to do. You see them? So now to me, it's like, I call the police. They're coming, an hour passed, okay, they're still coming. I'm still having hope. Mm-hmm. But I did not realize with me saying, oh, he's not a threat, he's not this. But in our culture and what we're used to seeing, especially in Atlanta, it is so many killings. And actually Nigel made number 53, and we wasn't even in the 6th month of the year. Mm-hmm. So that explains why my result wasn't to really call the police, but I had no choice, and it still failed me. Yeah. And keep in mind, this is what I do every day. Mm-hmm. I've been doing for 18 years, helping individuals with mental health and substance abuse. Yeah. So I question myself, how can I do this every day for families, saving families, preventing people from getting overdoses, bringing families together? Nigel was a part of the homeowners association where he directed traffic and helped the community and worked with the police, and you failed them. I don't care what you say. I don't care if it was prioritized as on a lower level because of the knowledge that I had and what I did. So what do you expect for me to sit quiet and say, oh, he has a gun? Because at that time, I didn't know he had a gun on him. Or even in the vicinity of where I was at, I didn't see a weapon. I'm telling you what I see. But I also know what I need to do to keep my son safe. And I did that, and you still failed me.
Yeah, and Georgia is deeply complicated. I want to go to Chief Miller here. And part of what's so complicated is that Georgia is an open carry state. So Nigel was not in the wrong, even if he did have a
And
weapon.
he knew that he was
that's
open
complicated,
carry.
right? These things
Yeah.
become extraordinarily complicated when you kind of move past the human part of it. It becomes very complicated. And so, Chief, this is every day for you. You understand risk. You have to deal with it. But can you help us understand not only like just this concept of risk, but like from the point of call to the point of getting a better response and better outcomes and kind of acknowledging that families need help? Like, tie this all together. We know what happens in call centers. We know what happened in Nigel, but talk about risk and how we can do a better job of it.
Well, you know, and this is a tragic story, and it rips my guts out every time I hear it. Unfortunately, like Dr. Skeem says, our system is set when we get our calls in our call centers are based on risk. But the risk is to the officer, the risk is to the first responder. And so the questions and everything right now, in my opinion, are centered in that way. You heard Dr. Cullins ask, please send EMS, do not send police. But yet, it takes 2 hours, and the risk with what they're hearing in the call center is they're making these judgment calls about, okay, is someone in crisis? Well, let's send EMS, but we won't send EMS without sending the police with them because EMS has to provide, the police has to provide security for EMS. And then what happens when we get there, the police knock on the door to secure the scene before EMS would go in. When you have people specifically asking, don't send police because of this collision of these resources that are being brought to bear in an inappropriate manner. Above and beyond that is we get these calls for service. The officers are and the call takers are trying to make sure that, like I said, the risk is taken on the officer standpoint. And we're not at all listening or concerned about what's going on until we get there. And by that time, it's too late. I can tell you time and call, again, her concern about her son being African-American. We get so many calls about people calling, saying there's someone who's walking down the street who doesn't live in this neighborhood. Well, what does that mean? And, you know, we have the bias of the caller, calling into the call center. The call taker's just taking that call, making a value judgment. There's someone's in a place that they don't belong, not once asking, you know, the questions about how do you know they don't belong? But the proper resource for that is to send an officer. And now you have this collision of, what are you doing? I see your ID. I'm walking down the street in my neighborhood. And you see it time and time again. If we were to stop, take a moment, take the focus from the risk to the officer to the person who we're talking to on the phone to try to assess what's going on, I think we'll make a lot of headway and these stories will subside. But until then, we still are in a situation where we're making these judgments on what we're hearing. Ironically, if you were to call into a dispatch center and say that you were in a medical crisis, perhaps exhibiting specific symptoms, we have this old form of dispatch questions called EMD, where we're asking very specific questions. We're asking about what the symptoms are, and then we can apply then solutions to the caller. But in that space, we're very, very person-centered in trying to diagnose what's going on over the phone as we're sending the resources there. We need to mirror those things in these types of calls. So triaging calls is quite literally in all these calls. I can only speak specifically for Irving, Texas, and the region that I'm in Texas, but my guess as I traveled around the country is it's the same in all of our call centers. We're making these, trying to make sure that we're keeping officers safe because, as you know, many of these situations are tense and uncertain and they're rapidly evolving. But the focus has to change. the focus has to change.
So one of the things we've been talking about, and Dr. Skeem, I'm going to come to you and talk a little bit. We're going to go back and talk about the positive outcomes of this process in general. But one of the things in part 2, in the recognition piece that we've been talking about is, as Chief said, ask more questions. And we've been talking about what are those questions that need to go into what already exists. So this is a complement to that, to really kind of think about particularly suicide risk as well as violence. And what does that mean in a clinical setting? I'm really excited about the research that you've been doing to really help us start to move from we are the people who know best to incorporating other folks into who are experiencing the crisis into this. So talk a little bit about the research that you've been doing, the questions that complement what is already there.
Yep, I'm happy to. We have tons of data indicating that we do better as professionals when we structure our own judgment. Lots of information on that front. And we're beginning to have information that shifts focus entirely from professional judgment to people who are living the experience. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you. So one of the bottom line, I mean, to blow the punchline, because it's already blown here on the slides, is that people with mental illness are often better at forecasting their own likelihood of violence and self-harm and suicide in certain situations than clinicians are, for sure. And they are as good as some of these brief but well-validated risk assessment tools. So that's the punchline. And the data and reasoning to back it up, which I can't help because I love it, is that we did a study. What you're seeing here is based on a study of 500 people who we assessed in acute psychiatric settings in a range of ways. But then we followed them after they were discharged into the community for about 10 weeks to assess whether they were, in the future, involved in violence or self-harm or suicide. And we did those assessments based on interviewing them, interviewing collateral informants like family members who knew them well, and also looking at arrest records and readmission records. So what we did, so just looking on the left side of the screen where it says patients' self-perceptions of risk outperform clinicians, it was one question that we asked patients that was based on my conversations with a lot of smart people, and thankfully we listened. So the question was this: how concerned should I be that you might be involved in violence after you're discharged? Their response was just one number, one rating, from 0, no concern, to 5, greatly concerned. And what you see here is a graph that shows their accuracy in predicting violence the 10 weeks after discharge, so what actually happened in the future. We also asked clinicians, how concerned are you that this person may be involved in violence or self-harm in the future? So you can see that patients blew the doors off clinicians in terms of their accuracy. So they had an area under the curve, which is a fancy term, but it performed about as well as we see when we're trying to predict these very complicated outcomes at 0.7. And clinicians were a bit lower than chance. So these were nurses, social workers, psychiatrists who got to know them, decently well in a short-term stay. If you shift focus to the right side of the screen, you can again see patients' accuracy in that first dark blue bar, and you can see readily that their accuracy is comparable to the best of those brief risk assessment tools, like the VRISK and the modified screening tool. We see the same outcomes when we shift from violence to self-harm and suicidality. And the important thing that I want to underscore too is that this also applies to family members who know people well. We know from the domestic violence literature, for example, that spouses perform as well as these fancy tools in predicting when violence is going to erupt in their households. So these, again, are people with lived experience who know themselves in a broad range of situations and have some expertise to share. So that gets us to the current conversation, because this person-centered approach, this is one question, right? So it's one question, but it's important because it provides a valuable data point that might help us be more accurate. So it's useful in that way. But I think in many ways, its real utility is that it treats the person, the people, as experts in their own crises and their own situations. It values their input. It provides them with an opportunity to give input and share their expertise. And when we pair that with something like structured professional judgment, I think that we would be light years ahead.
And so I'm going to go to Chief Miller. By the way, y'all, there are questions that come up here. They are behind what I'm asking, so I'm just going to keep moving. So Chief, this is a two-part question for you, because this is, I think what Dr. Skeem is saying is that we're asking you now to trust that when you ask people in a triage process, their propensity for violence or self-harm, that there's research to suggest that they're going to be more truthful, even sometimes outweighing our judgment, our own professional judgment in this space. Do you see a world where those types of tools are trusted based on the data? And then can you talk a little bit about how, just in general, this concept of understanding risk for violence and self-harm kind of has an impact on reducing arrest and violence, because you're more sympathetic to what's happening in the situation?
Yeah, I think so, because if we take that focus and put that weight on listening to the caller and asking correct questions, it will give law enforcement a better opportunity to respond differently. You've seen or heard and talked about these blended models where we're pairing police officers and clinicians together, and in some jurisdictions, paramedics together, and actually kind of taking a break and listening what's going on, and then trying to figure out, okay, there may be risk there, but we don't need a full-blown SWAT team response. How about we send our mental health response team, which is this blended model, and as we get there, we can better assess, we'll be better able to help the person who's in crisis and be able to defer or not even arrest folks and get them the help that they need. We've seen a lot of strides in this space where we are. Before, we would go to situations where people are in crisis and we would either use the criminal justice system and arrest them, or we would apprehend them without warrant to take them for emergency detention. And since we've started taking our time and slowing down, what we've seen is a decrease in arrests, we've seen a decrease in emergency apprehensions, and we've been able to help more people. We've even had the time to stop and then do follow-ups for those who we're coming into contact with, and kind of abating that continued behavior where we've got this, like I say, this collision between law enforcement and those who are in crisis. Mm-hmm. What I didn't say last time, which exacerbates this too, is this need to dispatch calls now. There's this need, if the metrics in all your call centers are the time, how long does it take for me to get the call out? And that system, that structure is opposite of what we're talking about. Because right now, as the call comes in, I'm measured as in the call center, how quickly can I get this call on the street, when we need to be stopping and assessing all these things. So I think we're heading in the right direction in this, what we're talking about here.
And Dr. Cullins, I want to ask the next question for you. But Chief, before I do that, I just want to make sure we are clear that part of the way call centers work is to clear the call quickly.
Correct, right.
Which then decreases the amount of time that you have in order to really unpack what you're hearing and be able to kind of deploy the right resource. So instead of, and we'll show you data, instead of using a minute and a half, you might be working with 45 seconds right, trying to unpack. And so this paradigm shift is going to slow things down. So there's some give and take in this concept. So Dr. Cullins, we've talked about race, and we're not this is not an undertone for this conversation. We're making it very clear that in some communities, your experience encapsulates what people really go through, particularly mothers of color, fathers of color, people of color, Black and brown people. And so what do you believe is important for us to build trust and confidence in the response system now on the other side of your experience?
I feel that if we can see, and I'm talking about the African American culture, that it is mandatory that the police officers receive mental health training. Not, a lot of times we have to have so many hours and they do what they need to do to get, but actually have mental health training where we have a training that is incorporated for special population as far as culture competency. So that way they know how to deal with certain type of people in reference to their background and demographics and things of that nature. And then the implementation of it. So the implementation meaning that the cases will go down because they have the proper training and we'll be able to see it. And the statistics and the data and everything that's being collected will start declining. I think that's a start. Now, the problem is much deeper and there's more things that I can go on for hours about, but I think that's just the surface of what can be done initially outside of the tools and the things that we're doing to ensure that everything is prioritized and the families get the necessary help that they need.
I appreciate that, Dr. Cullins, and I think, we talk about training all the time, and the truth of the matter is that lots of departments and responding agencies, whether they have a co-responder model and they have a multidisciplinary response team or some other form of response, they are trained. But I think the challenge is the culture of response, like how we respond and what we take into consideration as we're responding. And so, Dr. Skeem, there's a white paper that I think will be coming out very soon that really centers this concept of procedurally just treatment of people. It is how people being treated fairly, being heard and having the opportunity to have voice makes people feel like they are a part of a community. It understates or underscores self-worth. Why is PCTA so significant in kind of leveraging confidence in the system, but also giving people voice in the space so that they get the right care, but they're also heard as they're going through this process?
I think this is such an important issue, and earlier we heard that race and poverty are elephants in the room, and they're not. We're talking about them now. And it's going to take time and a lot of repeated, much better experiences and processes for us to get to a place where there is a sense of procedural justice and legitimacy. But I think, we talked, we started with a tragic example of how systemic factors made an interaction really difficult. That all of the information couldn't be shared because of a feared response. And that's so critical. People who live in disadvantaged communities where the hospitalization rates and mortality rates are highest are also the ones who are least likely to call the police for help. So that's really got to change. And I think that this person-centered approach is one of multiple avenues that have to be taken to help get us to a place that is better over time. For behavioral health emergencies, it's not just a lack of trust or perceived legitimacy, there's also an active fear of coerced treatment, fear of inappropriate incarceration, fear of just knowledge that use of force and potential injury is more of a threat in these situations. So, as we said in that quote, one way to try to get some traction on this is to change the culture, to change the conversation, to change the way that we're doing business every day. And one thing that we want to achieve is to create more of a sense of procedural justice in every one of those interactions. So procedural justice, it has 3 elements, and it's what we're trying to create with this approach, right? So one of the elements is voice. So feeling like you are heard during an interaction, heard. Another element is caring. In other words, feeling like what is being done to, for, or about you comes from a place of concern about your interests too. And also fairness. So believing that you are being treated the same way other people are treated in similar situations. So procedural justice is really important and something that we're after, and something that I think is really exemplified by this person-centered approach that we've described, where you're asking questions like, what is your need, right? Does it include mental health? What's the risk here? What's your preferred outcome? That kind of approach partners with the caller, again, as someone who has expertise in this crisis. If they are listened to and that information is treated with care, it can even help us get to a place where we're helping to diffuse the crisis, even if we can't always deliver on the preferred outcomes. If they're still heard and talked about, I think that's important. So this is community-oriented policing. That's another approach that really is aimed at trying to build procedural justice. And it's been shown to work when it's implemented well, that it does help people feel heard, and it does lend a sense of legitimacy. This approach is more specific to calls and people that involve mental illness, but we're really excited about this approach and are excited to partner with experts in call centers to evaluate it and see if it does yield the outcomes that we expect. Because we have to get to a place, long story short, where a caller can talk with the person on the other line without feeling like it has to be carefully packaged, so that they can actually share what is happening in a situation and can be listened to. And at the end of a call, we have a real sense of risk, we have a sense of the situation, and we, again, have a good first base for creating a system that is person-centered, where callers will call when they need help, and they will feel comfortable to share information.
And Chief, I want to just turn back to 988 really, really quickly before we go through the last concept here of like what the data shows us in these 3 areas. So you and I have talked about 988. I know you are, you think it holds remarkable promise, but as we started this conversation, we said that there may be instances where a person calls 988 and the call then evolves, and there's a need to now call for help in a different way. So so it's 911, 988, and there's not another number, right? So now you might have to come back to 911 depending on how this evolves, right? And so what type of information do you need from 988 or the person or the entity that's housing 988? What type of information would be helpful for you in a call center to be able to respond without having that caller start over? Because what we don't want to happen is that you've been on a call with 988 for 15 minutes, and then we realize that this is evolving, and now we start over at 911. So what type of information?
Yeah, it's not the type of information. I think it's the type of relationship that we have to foster between 988 and 911. We have to understand, because the leadership challenge is that I don't have to deal with these issues anymore because they're going to 988, and we don't want if they transfer a call back to us, we're going to fall back into that same response model that we had before. We have to have a level of trust between these two silos, that this person needs help, they need help now, but the way we respond has to look differently. The way forward, in my opinion, to speak to one of the questions that you can't see on the board, is these co-responder models are the way forward. We have to, you have the saying that if every tool you have is a hammer, the issues doesn't have to be a nail. I know I messed that up. But my point is, we can't have this one-size-fits-all response to these situations. So the way I would answer that question would be trust needs to be developed between the two, and they don't need to see each other as opposing silos. They need to realize we're working together. And then beyond that, as we respond to these situations, we need to make sure that we're responding smarter than where we are doing now. All the things you mentioned earlier, was procedural justice, race, all these things are leadership challenges as well. Leaders of policing organizations need to be upfront talking about treating everyone who they come into contact with. Our mission statement is quite very simple. We will proactively protect the citizens of our community. We will treat everyone who we come into contact with professionalism, dignity, and respect. And professionalism, dignity, and respect are sacrosanct. They're not questioned. And so that's me talking to a 23-year-old patrol officer. It's also the same message that I have for my call taker, that they have to understand that their job, if they were listened to, I need EMS, I don't need police, I need transportation. If you would listen to that, that's not the normal caller. That's not the normal caller.
That's right.
Yep.
There are I'm not even trained. That's somebody asking for very specific things that someone should have said, who am I talking to? Someone's trained. So if we would have listened and treated the caller with dignity and respect, outcomes would be different.
Absolutely. So before we answer, just turn to questions in the final minutes. A couple of things. You see the data here. I'll just walk through the risk piece just to ensure you know what it is. It's 85% of the calls in Austin. So this comes out of the Austin call center where they've already implemented part of PCTA as part of their normal calls response. 85% of the calls that were eligible for deflection, meaning mental health, they cast them as mental health, were actually resolved without the need for a mobile response. So those calls are being resolved almost immediately because they're being diverted out. The second piece, which is what Chief said, is that they pick up time because they are removing those calls out of the normal space of time. They're picking up 45 seconds to a minute to ask more questions and better assess risk. And then the really exciting part is that what we've seen is a 41% reduction in use of officer force for those calls that are identified as mental health. So that is not going to cover all use of force cases, but just specifically for those that are cast as mental health calls. As Dr. Skeem mentioned in the second recognition piece, that we know now from data that the individual responses outperform about 2 times the amount of clinical judgment. And then the final piece here, which the PowerPoint is in your package materials, is that we want to respond better to the community and their expectations, and the community expects that you treat them fairly, that there is a sense that when they call for help, they can get it. And so that's the final part of resilience and what we're building out as part of this process. So if you have questions for the panel, I'm sure they will be excited to have conversation and talk to this concept. Oh, I see. Okay.
My name is Katie.
May have to speak louder. I don't think the mic is.
Okay,
we can hear you now.
My name is Katie. I'm here from the Missouri Foundation for Health. We're a funder and certainly interested in changing systems around this issue. Because we're talking about public safety and the public's involvement in this, I was certainly struck by the way that the news report, kind of characterized this situation. And so I wonder, Dr. Cullins, if you would speak about how maybe the community responded to the way that they framed that. And clearly the data, for those who are data-minded, shows that the way that we're responding to mental health crises is inappropriate. Folks in mental health crisis aren't dangerous most of the time, right? But that perception from the media or from just our understanding of the world, I'm wondering about ways that we may be trying to influence the public's perception of mental health crises in the context of this conversation.
What I will say, because I can't say too much because of legal reasons, however, they tended to create a narrative, and I'm going to say that carefully. They attempted to create a narrative of a perception of what you saw of Nigel. Mm-hmm. When I was running for Georgia House State Representative during that particular time, and I was endorsed by different people, which they spoke on my behalf and the background of Nigel. And then when they came, it was, oh, this is not your ordinary black child. And the narrative switched. Mm. When I then asked, show the public the footage, then you're gonna get the real picture without me saying too much. And that hasn't happened. So I'm saying that to say, a lot of times the media wanna create a perception of this happened, and that, and then everybody believes it. But I want you to take a deeper look at the beginning and where the holes failed the system. And now you do have, no matter if he came from whatever class, upper class, lower class, middle, he is still a human being. And then that needs to be expressed, but then it just dropped. And then you move on to the next case, next killing, and the numbers just keep going. So hopefully I answered your question kind of, sort of, without saying too much.
I will also say that there was an actual mobile crisis unit in Atlanta, but it didn't expand to where Nigel was. And so the 2-hour wait, so the community, I will say, has been up in arms about it being 2 hours for the response to happen. But here's the truth of the matter. When and Dr. Cullins can tell you, there were all kinds of conversations. We're short-staffed. We don't have enough cars. The mobile crisis unit don't cover your area. I mean, so there's a lot.
The call line that you called in on is one part of Atlanta, but he was on a
another
different part of Atlanta.
And so
they're not connected, but it's all Atlanta.
It's just very complicated. And so, yeah, there are a lot of narratives to unpack in the use of these systems.
Yes, hello, thank you very much. My name is Jason Friesen. I'm a paramedic and the founder of Trek Medics. We build a crisis response platform specifically for mobile crisis response teams. And you had mentioned earlier Austin, Texas. That's one of the groups that we work with. The question I have is, in the case of Austin, we work with San Diego, we work with a bunch of other municipalities. They're all having their own scripts, right? Their own triage scripts. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there's any national movement or even at the state level to standardize this stuff, because as the chief mentioned, a lot of 911 call centers use EMD or MPDS, Medical Priority Dispatch Center system. But you can see, like in Rhode Island, none of the dispatchers were required to have CPR training. Mm-hmm. If 911 dispatchers aren't required to have CPR training, what training are they required to have, right? And so I'm wondering, we can learn a lot from 911, especially with 988, and I'm wondering if there's any kind of national or state level effort to standardize the triage process to use the evidence-based practices.
Chief, you want to?
I don't know about any national, but you hit the nail on the head. There's so many different ways. I can tell you in Tarrant County, Texas, is where our 911 centers are. There are 37 public safety answering points. 37. So that's 37 different ways that 37 different municipalities dispatch calls. I'm fortunate. I have a mobile a mental health response team. I have homeless outreach teams. We've invested in all these things that we ought to, but I'm going to tell you, across the road, nothing. And so our work that we hadn't even talked about yet is to start in Texas to try to get this standardized in one state, because you're right. There's so many ways that we can be doing, and and everything. The matrix are different, right? The way I'm measuring some of these PSAPs are how many calls I get in and how quickly can I get them out. PSAPs, in my opinion, I'm going to get in trouble. PSAPs, in my opinion, have turned into just call centers that are trained on how I get calls out. There's no person-centeredness. There's no, I got to get the call. I got to get the call. And then what do I do as a police chief? Then I measure how long does it take for you to get to the call? Mm-hmm. Response time. Mm-hmm. Those are my outcomes. And so we have to change what our matrix or what we're measuring. So we can answer some of these questions.
I can add just quickly to that Yolanda and I have been in conversation with people to add the national piece. 988 has inspired a lot of conversations about 988, 911, and interoperability. So there are efforts at the national level to take a close look at scripts and to try to do better on a number of fronts, including something as basic as identifying a mental health call. So trying to get some aspects into the scripts where that becomes a feature. And the second thing that I'll say is that we're partnering with 5 sites to explore this person-centered approach. And at each of those, part of the effort involves trying to work with the sites to see where in the script these questions could be implemented, like how to create something that would be seamless or as close to that as possible.
So we have, we're almost at time, so we're going to take one last question. I do want to say that my colleague here in the front, Jeffrey Malata, has handouts. So if you want more information about this process, we do have handouts that you can reach, or you can reach out to any of us and we'll be able to give you more information. Travis?
Hi, I'm Travis Atkinson. I'm the president of the Crisis Residential Association. I believe that our crisis continuum as we know it has been built over the last 50 years in communities where people decided to take on a little bit more risk in exchange for the reward that it brings. And so my question is, how do we prepare crisis call center operators or PSAP operators with the proper training or opportunities so that instead of always taking a risk-averse approach, they can be trained to ultimately be the most helpful for people and not be, let's say, punished in times where they're trying to use clinical or human discernment to make good decisions for the betterment of the people that they're talking to, while recognizing that that risk is inherent in the work that's being done and can never be completely eliminated.
I think he answered it. The training.
Yeah, I think that the work that's being done now,
Yeah.
and a mindset change in leadership, and then long term for me is we need to look at. I'm just going to say it. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, we were hiring call takers based on how fast they could type, how fast they could listen to a call, how fast they could type. And I'm not trying to be disparaging or pejorative, but we need to change the people who we put in these seats. Mm-hmm. We need to make sure that, why can't call takers be clinician or trained at a level of a clinician? Because this is the single point of failure for all. Look at Tamir Rice, look at any case, it's the information, how it comes into the dispatch center, how it's then sent out to the officers. It starts the cycle. And so I think there's some work can be done there.
If I could add just one thing, I think that decision tools can go a long, long way, because if they're provided with a tool to help them make that decision, that is the official tool, and it provides them with much more cover than they have now in terms of backup in making some of these judgment calls. And there are lots of lawyers who know more than I do, but my understanding is that's really helpful when you're using a tool and you're following a protocol. You have much more consistent decisions. It's not going to eradicate risk, and there will still be a tragedy, but you would also hopefully have the capacity to show evidence that generally you're doing a much better job than you were before.
And so we'll end today with a quote by Dr. Cullins, who's here. You see here that no matter what you go through, you deserve to be saved when you're in a crisis. And I think there's no better way to end than with a quote from her in honor of her son. So thank you. Please give my panelists here a round of applause for the information that they've shared. And we appreciate it.
And moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you, panelists. I would just like us all to take a moment of time, even though I apologize, we ran a little bit over, just to remember Nigel. Thank you. And thank you all for participating in this really important and innovative work. It was an honor to be in the audience for this. we have 30 minutes or so, 28 minutes, 26, whatever your clock says. Be back here at 2:30. There's additional snacks. For those watching virtually, please note that the handouts that are referenced, and Yolanda, I don't know if this one made it in, but they're in the Hoover app. So the papers that were referenced this morning by the judges and docs, those are under handouts in Hoover. And if you all wish to share any resources, you know, Sozosei has a resource repository, both on Hoover and on our website. So we're very open for anything you wish to share. Thank you all so much. I'll see you at 2:30. Thank you.